Hello, everyone, and welcome. I was really looking forward to preparing this lecture for you because it's a topic that is hugely important and fun too. We will be talking about working with parts, and by parts, I mean different aspects of your client's personality. There are personas almost. Hope you're ready, so let's begin. Many great coaches use the concept of working with parts. The reason is simple. Working with different parts of your clients is extremely effective because it taps into something very real going on in the human psyche, namely the fact that our personality is not simple or constant, but rather ever-changing, depending on multiple factors. Before we dive into the details of this type of work, let me offer you a brief background to working with parts. Many people in the coaching community have probably heard about Timothy Gallwey, who came up with the concept of the inner game. He pointed out that in every endeavor, there are two arenas that need to be mastered. It's the outer game, which is about overcoming external obstacles and overcoming external challenges. And then there's the inner game, which is what happens between what he called self one and self two, where self one is the critical voice that often gets in the way of self two, the unconsciously competent self. But of course, this topic goes way back. If we look at Freud's structure of personality, we will immediately spot that it was all about parts. First, there's the instinct-driven id, which is all about uninhibited behaviors, impulses, and cravings, as well as about meeting the basic survival needs. And then there's the ego, the planning, the thinking, and analyzing part. The ego is the mediator between the id and the reality of the outside world, the moral code represented by the superego. Now, the superego is mostly about internal evaluations of our parents or people who influenced us at a very young age. The interactions between these three parts of personality create what psychoanalysis calls the intrapsychic conflict. Later on, Jung talked about the persona, the mask that we adopt to help us deal with life and people. It helps us disguise our inner feelings and respond in socially appropriate ways. And Jung said, one could say with a little exaggeration, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. And then there's the shadow, the repressed material that we can find in our personal unconscious. Last but not least, Jung also talked about anima and animus, the unconscious feminine and the unconscious masculine archetypes. And of course, there's plenty of other archetypes in Jung's work. And I could give you many more examples, but I guess you get the point. The concept of different parts of personality existing within one person was recognized way back. Please note that we are not talking about the dissociative identity disorder, which is what used to be called the multiple personality disorder. The dissociative identity disorder remains a matter of controversy in psychology and psychiatry. What we do know is that dissociation is a natural reaction of the psyche to trauma that is just too big to handle. One of the coping mechanisms seems to be dissociating. But when we talk about working with parts as a coaching intervention, we are not talking about split personalities that are not aware of each other and that lose big chunks of memory and that would have an absolute control of the person. In fact, even up till today, psychologists struggle a little bit when it comes to an exact definition of personality, a definition that would be universally acceptable. One of the points where consensus has not been reached yet is the question, is personality stable across different social contexts, or does it change depending on the situation? For now, it seems like personality is an interaction between hereditary factors and situational factors. And here's when the parts come in. because sometimes the situational factor can simply be a certain level of stress or tension, and we slip back into default mechanisms that worked for us earlier in our life, and we somehow get stuck there. At other times, it can be a specific environment or a specific type of person that has us collapse back into a younger version of ourselves. In the next excerpt, you will be able to hear the client Tamara describe herself collapsing into her 10-year-old self.
Well, that was one other thing that I was going to ask you, is I was at a health show probably about 3 or 4 months ago, the same kind of one that you were in Vancouver when I met you, and there was, she's a doctor here in Calgary, and she was kind of doing the same sort of thing, connecting mind, body, and soul, and we went to her booth and we watched her presentation, and then she said, oh, do you want to do a little survey just to kind of see where you're at? And I said, sure. So I'm filling out this survey, and it was some physical things, some emotional things. And then she looked at my paper and she said, oh my God, girl, what happened in your childhood? And I burst into tears, and then my husband's looking at me going, what's happening here? And the first thing I thought of is, oh my God, Crystal told me about triggers, and this is a trigger.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you was, I did go through abuse from 13 to 19. It wasn't anyone in my family. It was a man outside of my family. And I spent years in therapy going through the memories and everything else. And I guess I'm unsure what to do about that, because, I've heard some people say the more you go back, you're living in it. You're just recreating it, and you're spending time in it. And like you talk about pity parties. But at the same time, I'm worried.
But you were a victim. So here's what I'm hearing, Tamara. Okay. I'm hearing a victim. And I'm going to tell you why I'm hearing a victim is because you were severely victimized. So when you've been severely victimized, it is your default setting. It's what you know, and you actually learned how to survive. You learned how to get by. You learned how to grow into a woman being a victim. You didn't have a voice. You didn't know how to have a voice. You didn't know how to share or stand up for yourself. You didn't have that skill then. But what the skill you developed was, okay, how can I get by being a victim? How can I actually, still survive and be okay in my own skin? So for a while, being a victim, in a bizarre way, worked for you. Does that make any sense or no?
Yeah, no, it totally does. It totally does. Yep.
And when I say that, what does that make you feel, what I'm saying?
It resonates with me because I think about even any time we have an argument with my husband and I, and it can be just something general. Yep. It shocks him sometimes because I shut down, and he's like, I feel like I'm looking at a 10-year-old because I curl into the corner, and I find myself, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm acting.
Yeah, because you are, because there was a certain point in your life, and if you can just close your eyes for a minute and take a couple deep breaths and think, when do you remember shifting from being confident, courageous, spoke your mind, laughed, said what you thought, felt great in your own skin, knew you could take care of yourself, knew the world would take care of you, knew you were safe and protected? When do you remember losing that feeling? How old were you?
Between 10 and 13.
Well, that's why your husband says, I feel like I'm looking at a 10-year-old.
People tend to resort to strategies that made them feel safe and that helped them survive physically or emotionally when they were children, especially when they were dealing with something unexpected or shocking. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as collapsing because we metaphorically collapse into a very young version of ourselves. Freud used to talk about regression as a defense mechanism that led the ego to reverse to an earlier stage of development, thus adopting the mannerisms of a child. And of course, all of this is unconscious. Working with parts is a universal intervention, and there are many, many situations where you might want to use it. But let me mention at least some of them. You can use working with parts when clients are stuck in any of the disempowered levels on the map of empowerment, but it's extremely effective at the lowest levels, that is, for the emotional level of shame, guilt, and apathy. The reason why working with parts is a fantastic intervention, especially for these levels, is because clients resonating in shame, guilt, and apathy tend to experience a significant amount of relief when the self is dechunked into several parts: the capable and resourceful self, and the self with the unwanted behaviors. By transferring intense feelings, the client is in a more favorable position to look at what is going on for them with more neutrality. This is what we refer to as transference. Transference is again one of the concepts used in psychoanalysis to better help the client understand their feelings. Transference is about unconsciously directing our feelings, particularly the ones from childhood, either to another object or to another person. In psychoanalysis, this person is often the therapist, who can end up being in a substitute position for another person in his client's life, the person with whom the client has some kind of conflict. In empowerment coaching, however, we help the client transfer these unwanted thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes to one part of themselves. Then we help them recognize the reason why this part was born and what its purpose is, so that they can stop struggling with themselves. You can use working with parts also for dealing with the common problem of procrastination and self-sabotage. You can talk to the wounded self responsible for these behaviors and find out why this part does what it does. Another way to use this intervention is to deal with the resistance in meeting goals. Most often, the resistance your clients feel, especially when they say that they truly want something, yet they can't make themselves do it, it's usually the resistance held by one of their parts. So no matter how fabulous the client's goals are, unless we help the wounded part to support the client regarding those goals, the results won't probably be great. This is another reason why in empowerment coaching, we go to goal setting as our secondary focus. And last but not least, because we also help the client identify the real self as we work with their parts, they automatically end up in a more resourceful place, ready to solve their dilemmas, tackle their challenges, or create something they long to create in their life. You will often hear me talk about introducing your interventions to your clients so that their mind is more ready and open to them when the time comes. In the following excerpt, you will hear Crystal talk about how the different parts are created. This, with or without the Golden Buddha story that is also part of the excerpt, is an excellent way to get your clients started on working with the different parts of themselves.
Because right at that time, your fabulous you, Tamara, who was going to go out there and conquer the world and be fabulous and have all these dreams, something began to happen, and her brain, so brilliant, said to her, the real Tamara, the brain was so brilliant, and it said, it's all unconscious, you had no idea that you were doing this, but your brain said, we're going to lose you. Someone's going to take you. You're not equipped right now. You're 10 years old, and you're not equipped for what's about to come. I'm stepping in, I'm taking over, and I'm going to run the show. And I'm going to protect you until you are finally in a safe enough place, and it's probably now at 31, with a man you can trust, in a loving home, that probably something in your spirit is now saying, Tamara, it's time. This 10-year-old hasn't been equipped to run the show. She doesn't know how to budget. She doesn't know how to handle money. You have a 13-year-old running the show, or a 10-year-old, somewhere in there, an 11, a 12-year-old that's trying to figure out. So when she doesn't get her way, she sulks.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't really speak up for herself. She becomes a victim. She feels sorry for herself. Yep. Because that's what 10-year-olds do. Does that make sense?
It makes.
Does that feel accurate when I say that?
Yep, 100%. 100%.
Yeah, what does she know how to get bank loans? And how does she know how to pay off student loan? How does she know, right?
Yeah, and even back to not speaking my opinion or being able to make a choice. I mean, I'm the queen of returns because I changed my mind 1,000 times.
Yeah, there's a wounded part of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And the wounded part comes out because there's a part of your brain that says, oh my God, this little girl is not equipped and we don't want her to lose her magic, her fabulous, her love, her greatness, her beauty. It's like that story that I may have told in that 2008 telecourse. In 1957, this is a true story. In 1957, there were a group of Buddhist monks, and they were in Thailand, and they were moving this gigantic statue of a clay Buddha. And the statue is thousands of years old. And in the midst of moving it, it began to crack. So they panicked and said, stop, bring in extra reinforcements, let's wait, let's not move this anymore. And in the middle of the night, one of the monks was doing the rounds. He had a flashlight, and he was out walking around, and he shined the flashlight up at this big, huge statue, and he noticed something glimmer. And this is a true story. And it would take a lot of courage. He didn't wake anyone else up, but he went and got a chisel. It would take a lot of courage for a crazy monk to go and get a chisel and start chipping away at a 2,000-year-old statue. But that's what he did. And when all the rest of the monks woke up in the morning, but there before them stood this solid golden statue. And the story goes that hundreds of years earlier, when the Burmese army was coming in, and I could be off on my dates, it might have been more than a couple hundred years earlier, but I think it was a couple hundred years earlier, the Burmese army was coming in. And the monks at the time thought that the statue would be stolen, for sure, the solid golden statue. And they thought if they covered it in clay, it wouldn't be deemed as valuable. It was just clay. And it worked. The army never stole the statue. But the trouble was that every monk was murdered. And the story could never get passed on until hundreds of years later when the statue was safe enough that it was time to chip away the clay. And the story always reminds me of us, women, us, men, maybe men too, people who, there was a time you were a little girl and you were safe and you were happy and you were fabulous and you knew you were golden. And something happens to us in our lives, and sometimes it can just be a really mean little girl in grade 3 that pulls your hair and embarrasses you in front of everyone, or it could be severe abuse. And severe abuse doesn't have to be stranger abuse. It can be sexual abuse from somebody you know that slowly strips away your ability to trust in yourself. It can be verbal abuse that slowly strips away your ability to feel like you can take care of yourself, that you're safe and protected. And what happens is the brain is so brilliant in all of us, and doesn't go to the extreme of actually creating a multiple personality, because multiple personalities, they actually don't remember. Like, they don't even know that there's that scared little girl, and there's this really strong Tamara, and then there's a party girl, or there's a sexy girl. They don't know that. They actually go out to the bar one night and sleep with somebody and come home and wake up the next day as a mother with no recollection of what they did. That's a multiple personality. But that's not what most of us are. What we have is that we've created personas, these aspects of ourselves that kick in and take over so that our magic doesn't get stolen. And so the real you is still there, and she came out during our telecourse.
Yeah.
During the telecourse, you were able to access and go, yeah, I can be me. I can trust myself. I can love myself. I can be fantastic. I can reach for my dreams. I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be covered in clay. I don't have to protect myself anymore. Life is going to give me what I need. I'm a big girl now. But when things happen, sometimes the smallest things, because what happens is the brain instantly begins to recognize anything as stress and says, oh my God, we're under stress. Default mechanism, kick in, wounded Tamara, who's actually got you by. How did she cope? How did that version of you cope from the time you were 13 to the time you were 19? What's the default personality? Who is that girl? How did she cope through all of that? How did she keep you safe? What did she act like? What did she do?
I think I was very much on my own. I just took care of it myself.
Yeah.
Because I had to. There was nobody else. So.
Let's summarize. Working with parts is not a new concept, but it certainly is a very effective technique to have under your belt. In this lecture, we covered the background and explained some crucial points related to working with parts. We will explore this topic in more detail in the video lecture called Working with Parts 2. Before we wrap up here, let me acknowledge that working with parts is one of the more advanced coaching techniques. Therefore, if it takes you a little bit of time before you become confident and effective in using it, be patient with yourself. Practice and you will be amazed. Good luck.